Hello everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to continue our unit on epistemology. This will be our last unit on epistemology, but it ought to be a good one. Let's jump right in. Okay, so last time, through the lens of Descartes, we heard about external world skepticism, right? The idea that maybe we don't have room to claim that we know anything about the outside world. Then we heard from Moore, G.E. Moore, who suggested that you don't have to accept that conclusion. Right? Remember, he gives his two hands argument. Here's one hand, here's another. Therefore, there's an external world. Right? Maybe that works. Maybe it doesn't. Either way, today we're going to turn to more global forms of skepticism. Remember, this idea of global skepticism is being skeptical of everything, not just this notion of an external world, but all kinds of knowledge altogether. Okay, but within global skepticism, there's a further divide. We have the academic skeptics, who are skeptics who claim that we can't know anything. We can't know anything at all. And then we have Pyrrhonian skeptics, who argue that we just don't have room to comment, right? So there's an important difference between someone who says, I know that we don't know anything, or I can tell you we don't know anything, and someone who says, I can't really give you an answer, right? I can't say that we don't know anything, but I also can't say that we do, right? So that's the difference between the academic and the Pyrrhonian. Both of these views are typically motivated by the same kind of concerns or arguments. The most influential argument that gets us to this kind of more global skepticism is called the epistemic regress problem. So let's take a look at that. The epistemic regress problem takes advantage of this idea that we need justification in order to have knowledge. Remember, knowledge is supposed to be JTB, justified true belief, right? So the fact that you have to get justification in order to have knowledge makes it an available target to attack. That's what the epistemic regress problem does. It targets our ability to actually gain justification. If we can't gain justification, well, we can't gain knowledge, right? Typically goes something like this. In order to know something, you must be justified in believing it. But how do you know that your source of justification is actually a good one? Maybe you don't really have justification at all. In order for your source of justification to count, you'll need some additional justification for believing that it should. But if you accept that, then you'll also need justification for this new justification. And this goes on forever, thus demonstrating that you can't ever really have justification. Okay. In other words, the idea is that if you need to have a reason for all of your beliefs, well, in order for us to accept that reason as a good one, we need further reasons, right? So it seems like you have to give me a reason for your reasons. But if I can demand that you give me reasons for your reasons, what's to stop me from demanding reasons for your reasons for your reasons, right? Can you see how this is going? There's not going to be an end to this. And the idea is if you can't answer each one of these demands, then at some point you are more or less saying, my belief is not reasoned. My belief is not reasonable. And therefore your belief is not justified, right? In fact, no belief is justified if the epistemic regress problem cannot be avoided. Here's another way to look at it. We have all probably had interactions with like hyper-curious children before, right? Who might ask a specific question and then tunnel down even further into the detail until you just have to give up, right? So here's an example how this might go. Why do giraffes have such long necks? Oh, well, they need to eat. They need them in order to reach the tree leaves that they eat. Well, why do they eat the tree leaves? Well, that's the most dependable food source for them, maybe. Why is that the case? And this keeps going, right? At some point, it seems like you're going to run out of answers. And the skeptic wants to say, when you run out of answers, you have revealed that you never knew anything to begin with. Why? Because all of these other claims were dependent on your answers now to these lower level questions, right? Okay. So the epistemic regress problem says, maybe there's no justification at all. We can never get it. There's a few options that the skeptic says we have. Okay? The first is to just accept skepticism, right? Give up. You don't know anything, right? The second is to adopt what's called circular reasoning, right? This idea that, well, this belief supports this belief. How is this belief supported? This one, right? So they form a circle of support, right? It's this idea that our beliefs justify one another, right? Most of the time in philosophy, we think that that's a bad way of going, because then it seems like you can justify just anything. It doesn't have to be connected to the world, right? Then there's dogmatism. That's when you just insist that something is true. So you don't have justification for it. You just insist that it's true. It's dogmatic, right? And then there's infinitism. Infinitism is the view that, yes, justification does require an infinite series. That is the case. But maybe that is all right. Okay, so none of these solutions seem to be like good ones if we really want knowledge, right? Even if you adopt something like infinitism, where you say, oh, well, this consequence is to be expected. That's how justification works. It's an infinite series. Okay, fine. But can we ever provide an infinite series of reasons? Doesn't seem to be the case, right? Doesn't seem like a thing we can do. Dogmatism? Well, clearly that's not knowledge. You're just stating that something is the case. Circular reasoning? Well, any old beliefs that cohere with one another can form this kind of circular reasoning. So it doesn't have any connection with the world. Why should we say you know those things? Skepticism, that's the denial of knowledge, right? So it seems like all of our possible options are bad ones, right? However, epistemologists don't just sit there, they're not responding at all, right? So over time, sophisticated responses have come about to try and deal with this problem. In fact, some of these solutions that he represented as negatives are eventually built into things that some epistemologists accept as like positive responses. We'll see some of those here. Or so generally we don't accept circular reasoning, but there is a kind of reasoning that some epistemologists today do accept that's similar. We call it coherentism, right? So the people who believe this would be called coherentists. Coherentism is basically just the idea that justification is a description of how well our beliefs fit together, right? How well our beliefs go with one another. So we can judge our beliefs based on their coherence, how well they hang together, not just how they compare to the world, right? If that's the case, well then, eventually you do run out of answers when the skeptic is asking you these why questions over and over again. Oh, well, you think that's the case? Why? You think that's the case? Why? Eventually, you're just going to repeat yourself because your system of belief is finite. And that's okay for the coherentist, because what really matters is just that these beliefs hold together in the right way. So in order to avoid the problem, these epistemologists are more or less redefining what it means for a belief to be justified, right? It means that the belief is part of a system that holds together well. Now, there are a lot of objections to coherentism. It's not immediately true that coherentism is the case, but it is an attempt at a positive solution to get us out, right? Okay. There's also this transition from dogmatism to something more robust, right? We call this foundationalism, right? So these epistemologists then are called foundationalists. Descartes is probably the most famous foundationalist. The idea here is that some beliefs do not need other beliefs to support them, right? So when you ask me why, when you ask me to give reasons for some of my claims, some of those claims do not have answers. And that's okay because they justify themselves, right? They're self-evident or self-justifying. For Descartes, an example of that is something like the cogito, right? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He wants to say that that's not doubtable, that we know it for certain, and we know it for certain not because of some other beliefs, but because itself, right? It insists upon its own truth, right? Just in believing it, you know that it's justified, right? So if that's possible, if such a belief exists, you can build all these other beliefs off of them, exactly the way Descartes wanted to do, right? And then when the skeptic presents you with the epistemic regress problem, and they ask you, Well, give me a reason for that. Give me a reason for that, right? They're making these constant demands. At some point, you do reach the foundation. You get to say, okay, well, here's the last reason, and there are no more reasons to give. You've satisfied the requirement. Now, the problem with foundationalism is you actually have to find these foundational beliefs, right? You need this to be possible. And it's not immediately clear that there are any foundational beliefs. Maybe there are, but it's not immediately clear. There's a few other responses to skepticism, less about the epistemic regress problem and more about global skepticism in general, right? Let's get to those now. But whether or not we can resolve the epistemic regress problem, there's generations of work on that, right? So we're not going to resolve that here. It's still an open question, but maybe there's a few other ways we can resist the skeptic's conclusion. We're going to look at a few. First, no miracles argument, an argument from practicality, and finally the skeptic's anti-skeptical argument. These aren't the skeptic's anti-skeptical argument's not a real name. That's just like a cute label I'm applying to an argument that sometimes gets used. Okay, first up, the no miracles argument. It goes something like this. If we don't have knowledge, then we should not expect much scientific success or progress. So if we don't have knowledge and there is scientific success or progress, then this is something of a miracle. Since explanations that don't rely on miracles are better, and because there's a good deal of scientific success and progress, it would be better to believe that we do have some knowledge. Okay, so here's how this argument's working. It's saying, look around you, right? We have achieved so much. Buses run on time, the wheels don't fall off, right? We develop vaccines. We seem to be doing a lot that would require knowledge. So the natural assumption is that we, in fact, then do have knowledge, right? This argument suggests that the only other line of thinking that could explain the fact that we seem to be making such progress without knowledge would be to rely on something like a miraculous explanation, right? It's a miracle that we have gotten things right even though we don't have knowledge. Or it's a miracle that we seem like we're producing progress even though there's no knowledge, right? And the argument is suggesting that, well, hey, this other assumption that we do in fact know, and that is why we're achieving so many things, is probably a better argument. In fact, any argument that doesn't rely on miracles is likely better. That's how this move works, right? But of course, the skeptic is always going to have some kind of response, no matter how you try to argue against them. Here, for example, they might argue that you think there is progress. You think that we've achieved scientific success in some regard. But you can't know that, right? Maybe if we return to Descartes' move, maybe you're just being deceived, right? Maybe you think the bus runs on time and the wheels don't fall off, but that doesn't mean that it does, right? It doesn't mean that it happens that way. Okay, well, now we're getting some really deep skepticism, right? How about this? The idea that we know explanations without miracles are superior. Maybe that's not true, right? Maybe the argument that, well, all of the success, all of this technological progress we seem to have made has come about through miraculous circumstance. Maybe that isn't any worse of an argument than the one that suggests that we actually know things. How do we know how to judge between the two things, right? The skeptic wants to challenge that notion that we can, judge one to be better than the other, because that's going to require knowledge of its own. Okay. How about arguing from practicality? The idea here is not to give a logical refutation, but to try and persuade, right? To be persuasive. Okay, so in this one, the suggestion is this. Skeptic, you've got good arguments, but hey, I'm a living thing, and this world has certain requirements of me as a living thing, right? I need to eat, I need to sleep, I have to do all of these other things involved with being an organism on this planet, and that requires me to form some beliefs, right? Requires me to form some beliefs, and I'm going to treat them like knowledge because that is the best way to get around in the world, right? So, sure, skeptic, I can't convince you that stepping out of your second floor window, your second story window, is unsafe. I can't convince you of that by your standards. It doesn't then follow that it is safe, right? Further, it doesn't follow that you're going to try it, right? So the argument from practicality is basically saying, look, we have to live in this world that has certain demands of us. We don't have time to be as skeptical as you would like to be. And in fact, I'm not sure you are that skeptical, right? You don't sit around wondering whether or not we actually should think twice about our judgments of like stepping out of second story windows, etc., right? Note the similarities here between this response and how James was objecting to Clifford, right? James, when he was objecting to Clifford, was saying, look, there are going to be times where there's emergent need, there's this urgent need to make a decision. The world kind of forces us, right, to form a belief. Argument from practicality does the same thing, right? Okay, skeptic, you might have some good points, but I've got to go on living in the world, right? Again, this doesn't really refute skepticism. Skepticism could still be like the quote-unquote correct position to take, even if you like the argument from practicality. The argument from practicality is more like a way of living or a way of being, right, that might encourage you to ignore the skeptic or something like that, but it's not a refutation of skepticism. Finally, and I think perhaps most interesting, we have the skeptic's anti-skeptical argument. Okay, so once again, it's just a name that I've made up here. This is an attempt at giving like a logical or a formal refutation of this kind of global skepticism. It goes like this. Your claim that we cannot have knowledge also has to be justified. And by your own lights, you'll never have justification for that claim, so you cannot claim to know that we cannot have knowledge, right? Finally, even if you could know that we can't have knowledge, you would know at least one thing. We can't have knowledge, and therefore your claim is self-contradictory. Okay, so remember the skeptic, the global skeptic, wanted to convince us we can't know anything. The idea here is that they are then suggesting that they know at least one thing, which is they can't know anything. Well, by their conclusion, they can't know anything. They also can't know that they can't know anything, right? So it kind of eats itself in this way, right? But it's important to note here, this is why we cover the distinction between the academic and the Pyrrhonian. This attack only works against the academic skeptic, the one who says, I know I don't know anything, right? The Pyrrhonian skeptic, remember, doesn't make a claim like that. They just shrug their shoulders. They refrain from commenting. So this really only has an effect against the academic skeptic. Still, it seems to be pretty effective against the academic skeptic. Okay. We're now going to kind of shift gears a little bit here and talk about a little bit more modern philosophy, right? Philosophy comes from more contemporary thinkers. First up, we're going to talk about Edmund Gettier, right? We're going to talk about Gettier's paper called Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? This is a super interesting paper, and it's only 3 pages long, right? It generated decades of work in philosophy. Decades of philosophers spent a lot of hard effort working on this problem that Gettier gives us in just 3 pages, okay? So in this little paper of his, which I think is like the only thing he ever wrote as well, he tries to give us reasons for thinking that we might be wrong about our view of knowledge altogether, right? Remember, knowledge is supposed to be JTB, justified true belief. Gettier is going to give us some reason to think maybe that definition isn't good enough. Maybe it's not up to the task. He does this by giving us a couple of different scenarios, right? So we're going to look at them now. Okay, so first scenario, the man with 10 coins. So suppose that there are 2 men that are applying for the same job. We have Smith and we have Jones. Smith has good reason to believe that Jones is going to get the job. Why? Well, we could say any number of things, right? Maybe Smith's interview went really badly. Maybe the hiring manager came up to Smith and said, hey, I'm just letting you know I'm going to give Jones the job, right? We would say very likely, right, that Smith is justified in believing that Jones is going to get the job. I mean, he was just told as much, right? I'm not sure you can be any more justified than that. Further, suppose that Smith has observed Jones emptying his pockets, counting 10 coins, and then returning them to his pocket, right? If that also happened, it seems like he would be justified in believing that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket, right? He saw him count them and put them back in. Seems like, yeah, pretty clearly the case. He's justified in believing Jones has 10 coins. But when you smash these two beliefs together, things get interesting, right? Because he's justified in believing both claims individually, it seems like he's also justified in believing this claim. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, right? Seems like he's justified in believing that. Here's the problem, okay? Through some fluke, Smith actually gets the job instead of Jones, right? Maybe the hiring manager confused their names, like mixed their files up or something. Okay, so Smith actually gets the job, not Jones. And further, Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. He didn't know it ahead of time, but he finds that that's true afterwards. Okay, so here's the problem. Smith had a belief, which was that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket, that we agreed was justified. And we now see that it was true. We now see that his belief was true. That means Smith had JTB, even though he thought Jones was going to get the job, not himself. Okay, but that can't be knowledge, right? That can't be knowledge because Smith thought Jones was getting the job. That's Gettier's point, right? That's what Gettier's trying to get us to. Look, JTB is not good enough because it allows some cases like this to sneak through when it shouldn't. To continue the point, he gives a second case. It has to do with Ford trucks and Spanish vacations, right? Okay, so this time around, Smith is thinking about two of his friends. He's got Jones and he's got Brown. Smith is pretty sure that Jones owns a Ford truck, right? Jones, let's say, has always driven a Ford truck. He offers Smith rides in this Ford truck fairly regularly. Maybe he even brags around town about the fact that he has a Ford truck, right? So it seems like we would agree Smith is justified in thinking that Jones owns a Ford truck, okay? Seems pretty straightforward. Smith has another friend, Brown, and Brown is currently on vacation and has not told Smith where he is. So Smith has no way to know where Brown is. He just knows that he's on vacation somewhere, okay? So it seems like Smith could adopt this belief. Either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona, right? Okay, why? Well, because he's pretty sure, in fact, he's justified in believing that Jones owns a Ford. So anything, he could think of anything whatsoever and attach it to that claim with the or, and it's going to be justified. Why? Because he knows the first part is justified. Anything, whatever comes after that is good, right? Okay, so Smith is justified in believing that Jones owns a Ford, so it really doesn't matter where he imagines Brown to be, because the claim is going to be true regardless, right? If he says either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Paris, okay, it doesn't matter like where he thinks Brown might be, because what makes this claim true is that Jones owns a Ford. And therefore, what makes this claim justified is that he has good reason for thinking that Jones owns a Ford. Where Brown is or where Brown is alleged to be does not matter for the purposes of justification. Just the first part of the claim, okay? Well, here we go again, right? Through some unforeseen circumstance, Jones got rid of his Ford. Maybe it was repossessed, maybe he sold it, whatever, right? So he does not, in fact, own a Ford. So it seems like Smith had the justified belief. It ended up being false. But miraculously, Brown really is in Barcelona, even though Smith has no reason for thinking that he is. Okay? Brown's never said anything about Barcelona. In fact, some people add an additional component. They could say that Smith has received postcards from Brown, like in London, right? Not in Barcelona at all. So he actually has reason to think he's not in Barcelona. Still, because of the way the claim was made, either Jones owns a fort or Brown is in Barcelona, we have all three ingredients. He has a belief that is justified, that is true. So it's supposed to count as knowledge under the account of JTB. But clearly Smith doesn't have knowledge here, right? He had no idea that Brown was in Barcelona. So how is it going to be the case that he has knowledge? Once again, Gettier thinks this just shows us that JTB is not sufficient, right? JTB is not good enough as a theory of knowledge. Okay, so how do we deal with the problem? Well, as I said, this spawned decades of research, right? This spawned decades of epistemologists trying to fix this problem. Some of them trying to fix it by arguing that the Gettier cases aren't like real cases of justification, or trying to argue that they're just special cases that we can ignore. Like, there's all these little small attempts. But the most famous, or the most infamous way of trying to deal with the problem is by correcting JTB, by adding something to it, right? So as we saw when we were going through the definition of knowledge, like, was belief enough? No. Seems like we need truth too. But is true belief enough? No. Seems like we need justification. Now the question is justified true belief enough? Answer, no. Okay. Solution, add something more, right? So it's this kind of like addition solution to the Gettier problem. The most famous one I think we get comes out of Alvin Goldman. Goldman suggests that we could add a sort of causal component to the theory of knowledge, right? By that he means, in order to have knowledge, not only must you have a belief that is true and that you're justified in holding, but your justification for holding that belief ought to have a causal chain to a real thing that would make it true, right? Here's an example to make it more clear to you. The famous example that Goldman used has to do with like a vase, right? So there's a vase in front of you, say, and you come to the conclusion, there's a vase in this room, okay? So you have a belief, there's a vase in this room, right? In this case, let's say it's true. There really is a vase in the room, okay? You're justified in believing it because you see it, right? And because you're actually seeing it, right? Light is reflecting off of it and back to your eyes, right? There is this causal process by which I can say, well, the fact of the matter is leading you to accept this belief, right? What is giving you the justification? Some kind of causal process between you and the world. Okay. But we can imagine a case in which things go a lot more strangely, right? For example, you could be looking at a very cleverly designed like hologram of a vase, right? Not a real vase. And then you make the claim, there's a vase in this room. Okay, well, you have a belief, right? It seems like you're justified in believing it. I mean, hey, it looks exactly like a real vase. Why wouldn't you believe there's a vase in this room? Is it true? Well, here's the trick. Let's say in a corner of the room, hidden by a curtain that you have not seen, there is a vase, right? So your claim is actually true here. Seems like we're going to run into another Gettier problem, right? Well, not so fast. Because Goldman introduces this causal component, he now gets to say, but look, your justification for thinking that there was a vase in this room was not connected to anything that would make it true. What makes the claim true? Well, there's a vase back there behind the curtain. Are you causally connected to that vase back there behind the curtain? Is your justification causally connected to it? No, it's not. Your justification is connected to this mirage, this hologram. And therefore, this doesn't get to count as knowledge, right? So he's got this clever way of building in an additional component that will maybe save JTB from these Gettier cases. Linda Zagzebski, the author of the second reading for this week, however, gives us some reasons to think that that kind of strategy is not going to work. Okay, so let's hear from Zagzebski. She more or less argues that Gettier problems come about because of this imbalance or correction with luck, right? So here's how she thinks it works. She thinks that Gettier cases happen when there's a stroke of really bad epistemic luck followed by a stroke of really good luck. Okay, so think about the Smith and Jones and who's going to get the job case, right? Smith had some really bad luck at first, right? He had pretty solid reason for thinking Jones was going to get the job. But then through some fluke, right? Maybe the hiring manager mismanaged their files, got them swapped, right? Through some fluke, he ended up being wrong. Okay, bad luck, right? He had every reason to believe what he did, but he was going to end up wrong, right? Bad epistemic luck. But he just so happened to have the 10 coins in his pocket as well. So that bad luck is succeeded. What follows it is a stroke of incredible good luck, right? She thinks that's what makes a Gettier case. We can see the same thing with the Brown and Barcelona case, right? He had every reason to think that Jones owned a Ford. It was very bad luck that Jones actually sold his Ford that morning, right? But it's followed by an extreme stroke of good luck, and that Brown, of all cities he could have been in, actually was in Barcelona. Okay? So it's really bad epistemic luck, followed by really good epistemic luck. Why does this matter? Well, she thinks that when you understand this, you can construct an example like this for any theory of knowledge that includes ingredients in this way, especially if they include justification, right? So it's always going to be possible to come up with cases that we can find this kind of epistemic bad luck being corrected by some amount of epistemic good luck, right? No matter what we add to the JTB theory of knowledge. Okay, so we mentioned Goldman's causal connection, right, as an attempt to repair it. This is how it could go wrong using Zadzebski's move here, right? Okay, this is a quote. Suppose there is a county in the Midwest in which the countryside is crowded with barn facades. To people driving straight down the road, they appear to be normal barns. But from any other angle, they are obvious fakes, right? So they're like these Looney Tune cutouts. They're not real barns. They just look like real barns from a certain angle. Our subject, Henry, drives through Barn County and forms many false beliefs about what he sees there. There is a barn, there is another barn, etc. His belief that there is a barn over there seems to be justified. After all, he sees them. But they aren't true. So we wouldn't say that Henry has knowledge in this case, right? Yeah, he has a justified belief that he's seeing barns here. There's a barn there, there's a barn there, but we know that it's not true. There's just barn facades everywhere, right? Suppose now, however, that there is a single barn in the mix. Say of hundreds of barn facades, there's one real barn. After spending a good hour forming nothing but false beliefs about the hundreds of barns he has seen, Henry now spots this barn and forms yet again the belief that there's a barn over there. Now the belief is justified and true, but most importantly, the barn is playing a causal role in Henry's coming to his belief, which was a necessary ingredient for Goldman, remember? Here's the problem. Henry has been employing this process, which has been returning not knowledge over and over and over again. Bad luck. Bad luck, right? He has every reason for believing that these are all barns. After all, they look exactly like barns, and who would put up fake barns, right? He's got every reason for thinking that these are barns, so he's justified. But the belief is false, and therefore it doesn't count as knowledge. Now, suddenly, one of these barns actually is real. Now his belief switches over to being justified and true. Not only that, but he has this causal connection with it that Goldman requires, because what makes his justification good? Well, the fact that he is seeing the barn, right? It's not hidden somewhere from him. He's actually seeing it, and that is why he's forming the belief that there's a barn there. There is this causal connection. But if this same belief-forming process has caused him to get it wrong hundreds of times in a row, are we just suddenly going to say, oh, it worked this time? Yes, it's good this time? Zabzebski, says no, right? No. He just happened to be looking at a real one this time. It was a stroke of luck, right? A bunch of bad luck followed by a stroke of good luck. So once again, it seems like we can make Gettier-like cases out of any kind of theory of knowledge that tries to build off of JTB. Okay, but why? Why is that true? Well, ultimately, Zagzebski thinks it's because justification is necessarily different from truth. Justification is never going to guarantee you truth. There's always going to be the possibility that you can be fully justified in believing in something, and then it ends up false. And if that's possible, it will always be possible for some stroke of good luck to have made it actually true, even though you didn't deserve it, right? Here's what she says. As long as the truth is never assured by the conditions which make the state justified, there will be situations in which a false belief is justified. I have argued that with this common, in fact, almost universal assumption, Gettier cases will never go away. And if Gettier cases can never go away, then there's no real repairing of JTB. There's no real fixing this idea that we can define knowledge with this component view, right? That knowledge is justified true belief, right? Plus anything else. Does that mean that skepticism wins? That since we can't even really define knowledge, that we should just assume we don't have it? No, not necessarily. Most epistemologists, to be clear, are not skeptics. And there are some, like Zagzebski, who argues that this just means we should replace justification, right? We should think, okay, true belief, that makes sense, but maybe we should have something else other than justification. Maybe it's not doing the job we wanted it to do. Okay? We don't really have time to go into her proposed solution or the many other epistemologists who propose alternatives to justification, but there are plenty of them out there. So the battle is not yet won for the skeptic, but there are some serious problems that we do have to deal with. But for now, we're going to leave epistemology behind, as next time we're going to start diving into the philosophy of science, right? We're going to look at one of the main issues in philosophy of science, which is whether or not science, like as an endeavor, is getting us closer to truth. Okay? Whether or not it's getting us closer to truth. It should be interesting. All right, so until then, stay healthy, stay safe.